In the back, thumbs up, thumbs down. Can you see it? Okay. If you can't see it, I saw somebody squinting up here. There's a chair right here. Okay, so here's our orange tree testing now. So this is going to be a little different. Before we were modeling an orange tree, and now we're going to walk through TDD with an orange tree. And hopefully compare it in a few examples to how the assignment does the same thing. So what the assignment does, if I go to the instructions, is it gives you like test by test, like what you're supposed to do. It says for the test description use blank, and then it tells you what to test for. And then it gets down to like number 4, it says throws error if type is not passed into constructor as first parameter. That's the instruction it gives you, and then it says, okay, write that test and then go write the code. So we're going to use a similar framework here. So in our TDD Recap code, we're going to look here, and here I have the exact same numbers 1 through 6, and they have the quotes. And so from those quotes, we're going to say, here's the test we're going to write, and then we're going to go write the code in orange tree. And we're going to work through them one by one. As a precursor, just as a recap, because we only spent one day on this, the index.js file, this is what's actually running our tests. So what this file is saying is, hey, get me Jasmine from the internet, from NPM, and then for every spec file that's in the spec directory, so go to the spec dir, that's what this means, go to the spec directory and go to every single file and then run it. That's what this execute's doing. So I saw someone the other day trying to debug their code, right? And we all like to debug our code. And so one of the things when we debugging our code is we comment stuff out to make sure that what we have is working. So this person wanted to see just console log run, and so they said, okay, I'm going to comment everything out, and they ran it. But that doesn't work because our index.js is actually requiring those files and actually running them ourselves. So if we want to actually require that file, we need to leave that code in our index.js. And we'll see it actually ran that debug our code method once it required the actual file. Okay, so every test class that you have usually brings in this method assert, or this module assert. And so we're going to use assert to compare equal and expected along the way. And then the next thing you do, whatever you want to test, you also have to bring that in. So on line 2, we're testing orange tree. This is orangetree.spec. We're going to bring in orange tree into our module. And if you're testing command or rover or message, you have to bring those classes into your test spec in order to use them. And then these steps 1 through 4, Ben actually wrote these as a note and I included them. These are ways that you can think about every single test case. So it's like more of a methodical process. So every time we come to a test case, we can do these same steps in order to do our test. So here's our first test. It's written for us, but there's no code inside of it. The test says it should set the age and height to 0 upon creation. And actually, I'm going to change that to actually be just as it is in number 1, right? So a tree should set age and height that are passed in as parameters. So the first thing we usually do is we create a test object, the thing that we want to work on, the thing that we want to compare. And to make it super obvious, we can just call it test obj. And then what is that test object going to be? Yeah, it's an orange tree. And how do you know that? Well, the biggest clue is that we're in the orange tree test. So usually, if you're in the rover test, you're going to make a rover. If you're in the command test, you're going to make a command. If you're in the orange tree test, you're going to create a new orange tree. So this is our test resource. This is our test object. And then we have our expected values. And what this says in line 9, a tree should set age and height that are passed in as parameters. So if I said age is 3 and height is 7.5, and I pass those in as parameters, what we want to do is test whether our test object has assigned those properties. Now, because I'm not going to quite test yet, I'm just going to console log it, see what we got. So I ran my code and it printed out this orange tree, and it says age 3, height of 7.5. So if we look back over in our orange tree code, it is setting those properties. It's setting age to age and height to height. So that's our orange tree code right there. Now when we want to actually test, we use this assert module that we brought in. And we can say assert strict equal, and what we want to say is first the description, age and height are passed in as parameters, and then we want to give it what we expected. So we expected test object, oops, let's get rid of this. We expected test object.height, and we expected it to be 7.5. Is this the correct syntax for assert strict equal? What is the correct syntax? Do we not give it a description at the front? Okay. I spent all day in a different language, so that's my fault. So our strict secret, we're just giving it two arguments. We're giving it what we expected and what we actually got. So it ran, it didn't really print anything out, which is good, I guess. It means it ran and it succeeded. If we were to change this to say, hey, did we give it a height of 7.5? This should fail because we gave it 7. And we say, hey, we expected 7, but we actually got 7.5. And that's how we would write a single test. In this case, our test is, did we set the age and the height that are passed in as parameters? So let's try the next test. If I have an it block on my next test, what's my description? What am I putting in there? How do I know what I want to test next? Yeah, exactly. So I'm still in the same describe block because I'm still testing the orange tree, right? Should I add it to the same it block up here, or should I have a new it block? New it block. And why though? Yeah, kinda. Yeah. Yeah, I kind of like that, both those descriptions together, and I'll repeat them for the video. We've already done a test here. We don't need to confuse it by adding more and more tests within that same block. We've already done one. It's already done its one thing. So let's go on to the next one. In more simple, hey, we got a new number, so let's write a new test. We got a new instruction, let's write a new test. So what's my description for this it block? When I said description, I didn't mean a new describe, but what am I writing in there? Exactly.
So on that other one, do we not want to test both height and age? Is just checking the one good enough?
I think you're right. The question was, should we test height and age, or just height? What do you think? Probably should, right? Yeah.
Does it work with two assert statements, or does it stop with the first one?
Let's try. So I'm going to comment out lines 17 through 20, and we're going to see if it works with two assert statements. Yeah, it runs. Now you notice it only says one spec, because it's part of that same it block, but it still works. And if we were to change this, and it was going to be wrong, it would say one failure, even though half of it passed and half of it succeeded.
What if they both fail? What pops up then?
Failure. So another way to do it is you could instead of having 2 asserts in this it block, you could put them in a different blocks, right? So this one the first one here could be a tree should set age that's passed in, and that would only test age. And then you could do another one that said a tree should test height that's passed in, and then that would only do height. That's probably the best way to do it. Yeah, question?
Can you test 2 parameters and 1 strict equal, like an AND or an OR?
The question was, can you test 2 parameters and 1 strict equal using an AND or an OR? I'm saying maybe, but nah, don't do that. Yeah.
Instead of using and or, can you put parentheses around 2 expected values like height and age?
Yeah, the question was, can you combine those values? So
Using parentheses, you put test object height, comma, test object age, and then the expected values also their own parentheses.
yeah, you can absolutely do that. I still probably wouldn't suggest it, but it looks like it'll work. I think this is, in other languages and probably in JavaScript, is what's called a tuple, which is a type of collection. So you can do that if you want. I think for me, I like to keep it simple. I would probably just do 2 tests, because what is it? You just copy and paste this over and change a few things. But yeah, that would work. Commenting back in on my code, line 17, a tree should initialize with a default age of 0 and a height of 0. Now we got that description from here. And then kind of going by our steps, the steps we always do, the first thing we do is create a test resource. So for us, what is that? Our test object again. And because we're in the orange tree class, it's probably that. Now this says initialize with a default age of 0 and a height of 0. So for this case, I'm not going to pass in anything, because a default means you don't pass in anything and it gives you a value there. So I'm not going to pass in anything there, and that's going to be our default age of 0 and height age of 0. And then I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to say, give me this test object, and the height should be 0. And that succeeded. Now we're working, just like the assignment, we're working right now with a few of the bit of the code that's already passed in. Right? This is analogous to like the name and the error that's already passed in. Now for the rest of these, 3, 4, 5, and 6, we're going to do like the assignment, and now we have nothing. Now we're going to add it all ourselves. So how would we do that in a test-driven development fashion? That's what we're about to do. So let's do number 3. Number 3, is that an it block or a describe block? Why? Yeah. And so actually, are all of these going to be it blocks then? Yeah, they're all going to be it blocks. So we write our function. We create our test object. Our test object is going to be the same thing. New orange tree. Now what are we actually testing? We're testing whether a tree is 6 years or old or more is mature. So then what should our age be for our orange tree that we pass in? Like 7, right? It should be older than 6 to see if we can test whether it's mature or not. Yeah, exactly. 6 is also mature. So let's say our orange tree is 7, and it's age of 7, and it's 15 height. And just to make that more clear, we can add them as variables right here. We can pass in age, we can pass in height. Now what is our assert statement then? Well, we could look back at our orange tree, and we have this isMature method, and it doesn't have anything in it, but we have this method. So we can use that. So we can say strict equal, and this new orange tree that we created has this function on it. So we can say what is our test object, is mature, and what should that return us? True. Now, test-driven development means that we wrote the test, we run the code, and it fails. It's called red, right? Sometimes you'll hear people talk about it as like red, green, refactor. The first step is red. You write the test, it breaks on you, it fails. We expected true, we actually got undefined. Well, that's because we haven't implemented the method yet. So we go back into Orange Tree and we have is mature, and now we have to actually write is mature. So what's a quick way that we can fill out is mature so it would return us what we want? We could do that. That's going to pass. Now, that's probably not the best example, and then we'd have to prove it, right? So, okay, that does work. So we could go back to our orange tree, and we could say a tree which is less than 6 years old is immature or not mature. And this one, if we have age is 3 and height of 12 or 7.5, and our test object is a new orange tree with age and height. Now, what should we expect to see? We should expect to see test object.isMature to be false. Now, I have a feeling this is going to break. Yeah, it broke. I expected false and I got true, because back in our orange tree, we just wrote true, which is not, it passed one test, but it is not working. So we had to add an extra test just to make sure. So we can say return this.age is greater than or equal to 6. And we can add that to our isMature function. So now we fixed the code, we run the test, all tests pass. When you don't see anything, that's kind of like a green test, I guess. That's what these green dots mean. In fact, I think there's one dot for each success. All right, so back to the spec. What is our next test? Yeah, a tree should age 1 year. Every growing season, which I just copied down there, a tree should age 1 year. So the first thing we do is we write our test case. If we want, we can look at our orange tree to understand what's going on. So we have a constructor, we have isMature, we have past growing season. So we have some understanding of that. And we'll try to write the test. Tree should age 1 year. I'm going to put this each growing season in there too. Describe block's becoming large. This is where some people, I think, would say, you know what, I'm going to make a new describe block and make the describe block just about passing growing seasons. But it doesn't matter either way. Each growing season, the tree should age 1 year. And we have our function. Now, what's the first thing we do when we make a test? Resource. So what do we write?
Yeah, that's good. You forgot quotes. There it is.
No, what is our resource? The first thing we always do is create our test object, our thing. In this case, it's an orange tree again. We're still testing an orange tree. Yeah, question? We create an orange tree. Now, we didn't pass any parameters. So what is orange tree age and height going to be? Yeah, 0, 0. Is that fine for this test? I think so. You know, maybe it's a little, because then we can say test obj, and we call a method on it, right? What method do we call? Yeah, we call this past growing season. And then when we do this assertion again, and we look at test object.age, remember we're testing age, we look at test object.age, what should it be? Yeah, it should be 1. So we wrote the test, we run the test is broken. The broken doesn't mean bad, we just haven't implemented it yet. So now we say expected 1, plus sign is expected 1, minus sign, what we actually got was 0. So now we go back to orange tree and we say, okay, for every growing season, my age should be equal to my age plus 1. So every growing season we increase age by 1. It was correctly pointed out that age is not defined, but this dot age is defined. And we got 5 specs. So now take 4 minutes and write test number 5. Write test number 5, make it fail, and then go to orange tree and make it pass. If you want to catch up to where I am, you can always refresh the page if you're on my namespace. And if you're writing number 5 and you haven't done it yet, only write that first line. A tree should grow 2.5 feet taller each year, right? That's your first test. And then a test after that would be, shouldn't grow after 25 feet. prove it up here. There's no test in here, though. There's no test in here. Nobody gave that feedback? You were all just watching for 5 minutes.
Yeah, so
The solution is coming up on the screen there. And I see a few people have moved on and done the test, the depth function, and then the 25 feet version. All right, so we'll come back together up here as a few of you are working. So this was a fantastic example. Someone came up here and coded out just like their way of working through it, right? And so together we're going to kind of try to debug what's going wrong and if we can improve upon this, right? Because we're always trying to improve upon what we can do. So the first thing is after you write a test, before you move on to the next test, what should you do? Yeah, to first of all run it, and then after you run it, you want to make the test pass. So if we run this code, missing parenthesis after argument list. Does anybody see what's going on? So let me run it again. Oops. Okay, so we have a real failure, right? We got 2.5 and we expected 12.5. So if you take a break from your code and you come back after walking around for 5 minutes and you come back looking at this, and we have to help debug what's going on, right? So the first thing is we look at what we're passing into functions. So we're not passing anything into Orange Tree, which is fine. That's going to work okay. And then we're passing stuff into past growing season. So let's look at both those functions. We look at those functions and the constructor, which is new Orange Tree, we can pass stuff into there if we want. And past growing season actually doesn't take any arguments. So that one doesn't take any arguments. So instead, what should this code look like? These two, yeah, exactly, empty parentheses here. Because we're not using any of those arguments, so we shouldn't be using them passed in. So we run this code again just because we changed something, and we get a failure that say, hey, I still got 2.5, I accepted 12.5. Yeah, so you can either do one of two things. You can say, hey, I want my Orange Tree to start off at age of 5 and the height of 10, or you can change this, what you expect, to say, okay, if it starts off at 0, then I expect it to be only 2.5 meters high. But I like the idea of starting it off at age 5, height of 10. It's something different than just starting at 0. And so we changed a bunch of stuff. We make it run just to see if it runs. And it does. Cool.
You can just do, let test object equals new Orange Tree and then put your parameters in and not define each item up above.
So the question was, can you just define the parameters straight in the constructor like that? Let's see. Yeah, you can do that. So what would be an advantage of doing it this way that you mentioned instead? Yeah, fewer lines of code. Yeah, yeah.
Could you just define the variables right in these describe functions, or would it be used throughout all the blocks instead of having to retype them every time?
Yeah, the question was, could you define the variables up here and you could reuse them every time? Let's try. Let's get rid of all these ages. So that age is, well, let's just get rid of that age, right? And I think this is going to work. I'm not 100% sure in Jasmine. I'm going to put an F in front of that, and what I'm trying to tell it there is just run that one test. Yeah, it did it actually. See how it said ran 1 of 6 specs, but I only ran 1, 0 failures. So it didn't fail the others, it just ran that one. So that's kind of a trick. If you really just want to, like, you're annoyed of all the tests printing out every time, you just want to do one, use that little F. It'll work for a describe block too. It looks like it worked. Yeah. Now, I would be a little cautious because I bet if we added this here also, how am I going to say this? Let's say we had this one too, right? And let's say, actually, I'm going to keep changing my mind. Let's say we only ran 2 tests. We ran the first test and then we ran this 4th test. And you also wanted age to be 3, so you're like, screw it, I'll just use that original age I set, right? But then, you know, somewhere here, somebody else came in and said, at the same time, I want to pass a growing season. I want to test something else. Now what's going to happen? Are they both going to be 3 still? Probably. Yeah. But what if someone else came by and said, you know what, now that I want to test something else, I want age to be 4. So some things you can get away with, but it becomes more and more dangerous. Not trying to confuse people, but there is a hook called before each. And this code will run before every test anew. So this is what you're looking for. And then whatever you define in there will be accessible in every single test that you run. Yeah, that's a good question. I'm going to go over 2 or 3 kind of, or one thing I noticed about the assignment that was kind of a gotcha. But as far as like TDD, declaring test object, and then moving through them, are there any other questions before we move on? Yeah.
I noticed when you find orange tree.js in the constructor, you have default values. Yeah.
So you're talking about in lines 6 through 9 how we have default values.
Yeah. So if you're gonna set default values, that's proper syntax.
Correct. Yeah. If you want to set default, the question was how do you set default values? And so if you don't have anything there, then when age comes through, if nobody sets it, it's going to be undefined. But if you have an equal sign, then if they don't pass in age, it'll come through as 0. And that's what your default value is. Yeah, that's a good question. Anybody else? All right.